The advent of photography in the mid 19th century is a game changer in so many ways. Pause for a second. Just think about the multiple images cross, that traverse across your retina, that you take, that you view on a daily basis, the sheer number and phenomenon, the multiplicity of those images. At this time, photography is still something quite novel. We will very shortly see two major ways. One that is a one off, the daguerreotype, when Daguerre came up with this technique, which he did not develop alone. Um, well, other whole long other story. Um, Only one collaborator is publicly um, represented or included in Daguerre's patent of his discovery. "I have seized the light," he exclaimed quite dramatically. But daguerreotypes were one of a kind. The second most important medium is Talbot's calotype, which, because it employed a negative, was reproducible. When we think about photography at this time, though, one of the things it does that is so highly significant is that it represents a key moment in modern art, as does Impressionism, because photography allows painting's role to change. By the time when we get down to Impressionism sunrise in 1872, artists such as Monet were no longer required to faithfully reproduce real life reality because the camera can do that. It frees painting from its traditional classical role of documentation, of objective recording. The significance of Daguerre's early daguerreotype here, the artist studio, is not because of its content. It's because this content is captured. These are just odd elements in a corner of an artist's studio, some little ceramic putti, angel cherubs' heads, a raffinato, a straw wine cask, a painting framed on the wall. These are incidentals in a sense. What's important is that these incidentals are represented, are brought to life through the use of this new medium. So it's the medium here that is more important than the content. Gustave Courbet, in the Stonebreakers that we are looking at here and in the following Burial at Ornans, is changing the face of 19th century French painting. He's denying it in a sense, sometimes was perceived as insulting it. His apparent lack of formal composition compared to what came before is one of the things from which that idea of his radical revolutionary achievements um, were criticized for. There's a denying of traditional illusionistic depth. There's the taking of a small idea, peasants, stonebreakers, and making them big, making them ambitious. So modest, casual, agricultural subjects that are glorified. Um, I won't call it socialist, but it's the idea that this landscape is privileged, is revered. Um, Courbet is our best example of a French realist. When we're looking at realism in America, we're looking at Thomas Eakins and Winslow Homer. Here we're looking at Gustave Courbet. Decidedly unsentimental, though, in his rendering of the working rural class, the farmer, um, as hero. We can think back to looking at Géricault and Delacroix and the way their common folk revolutionaries and Goya's 3rd of May are privileged, are given agency in the same way. Courbet was an observer, an acute observer. He wanted painting to strictly represent what is, and we see Manet taking this a step further. They're denying the three-dimensional depth of illusion present in romanticism, in romantic painting, and emphasizing two-dimensionality. Not on your lecture guide, but A Burial at Ornans is also a signature example of what Courbet did so well. Again, he's performing something in the history of painting here that's considered rather heretical. It's a very loosely organized painting compositionally. Again, he's using a very simple theme, like as in the Stonebreakers. This is a burial in his provincial hometown, and he's depicting this event in a manner that would be reserved for grander events. This is a burial of common folk, actually his grandfather. It's a simple funeral ritual. There's no pictorial narrative other than that. There's no hierarchy. These people are unflinchingly real, and they're not romanticized peasants. That's important to note. Also, if we look at the date here, we're seeing work that 1849 is in the wake of the French Revolution. So again, these movements of modernity and revolutionary and change are both part and parcel of what is occurring in art at this time. There are so many ways in which Edward Manet is significant to this period of modern art. Recollect once again that prior to the 19th century, not that long ago at this period of time, for the most part, artists are commissioned to make artwork by institutions like the church or wealthy patrons. Much of this art is depicting religious or mythological scenes, telling narrative stories. They were often instructive, sometimes in the way of an allegory. When artists started to claim their own agency, they were making work about people, places, ideas, the concept of water, impression sunrise, that interested them and that reflected their experiences. So they are banishing themselves, in a sense, from the classic academic salon system in which artists are exhibited in an academic forum and are critiqued. So radical artists like Edward Manet and Gustave Courbet were greatly censored by the respectable public. Manet picks up on the realism of Courbet, although Courbet was scandalized by his Olympia. The other thing we see, of course, is that in all movements, what comes before and what comes after has a level of acceptance that shifts with time. So we see those who are revolutionaries looking at what comes after their work that so incited controversy, and often, if not deriding it, not approving it. Manet was constantly and prolifically moving beyond his own achievements and accomplishments. He's often spoken of as the father of Impressionism, but it's not truly accurate to categorize him that way. Although that's generally how he is represented, but he moved around and beyond Impressionism. He was arguably the most important and influential painter to have heeded or responded to or embodied the poet Charles Baudelaire's call for artists to become painters of modern life. Manet had an upper class upbringing, but he was quite bohemian in his own life, and it's thought he He enjoyed scandalizing the French academic salon and the public with his disregard for academic conventions, his unconventionality, and his striking modernity in terms of depicting urban life. So he was certainly an important influence on the Impressionists, and he learned much from them himself. But there are also aspects of realism and even naturalism in his work, where Manet's modernity lies above all is in his eagerness to update older genres of painting by injecting new content into them or altering conventional elements. So he possessed an acute sensitivity to historical tradition and juxtapose that with contemporary reality in an entirely different way. He popularized a technique called alla prima painting. Instead of building color up in layers, he would lay down the color that most closely matched the final effect he sought. And the Impressionists began using this technique. They found it very well suited to capturing the effects of light and atmosphere, as Monet did in Impression Sunrise, especially while painting outdoors in plein air painting. What's notable about Manet's technique is his very loose handling of paint, his quick laying down of his color, and the way his volumetric approach, the way he's rendering volume that leads to flatness. This flatness was completely modern and greatly critiqued at this time. We might not see the influences of the Renaissance artists Giorgione or Raphael in Manet's work, but those were his influences and his masters, which he then fractured by disregarding perspective, again creating this flatness, and not working with light sources that could be termed natural. What's most arresting in his Déjeuner sur l'herbe, or Luncheon on the Grass, is this outrageous presence of a completely unidealized female nude confronting the viewer. Sometimes said on a sexual level. I would contest that. It is also a representation, it is thought of in art history, of Manet. There's this idea that he always was using himself through his subjects that as a way of engaging with the public. So in a sense, he's positioning himself as a painter, confronting the prevailing mores of the time, challenging ethical and aesthetic boundaries. What do we have here? We have this, again, female nude, rather casually engaged with us, so in such a very even contemporary way, with these fashionably dressed men in this painting. Can anything be flatter than the surfaced here? One prominent art critic called it the first modernist picture by virtue of the frankness with which Manet declared the flat surface on which it is painting, or painted rather. Again, Manet's modernity is present, above all maybe, most obviously, in his eagerness to update older genres of painting by injecting new content or by altering conventional elements. He sets the stage for subsequent artists. He teaches them how to make the old viable and visible, as well as making it something new. So this juggling, this balancing, this creating of a resolution maybe, or maybe just an ongoing tension between contemporary reality and historical tradition, is his hallmark, I would say his genius, and certainly at his time, the major cause of many of the scandals his work provoked. There's also the idea that this sort of unnatural light that he used, this flatness, was also, in a sense, rendered the idea of painting similar to the popular posters of the day, that it contained the same degree of flatness. When we talk about the composition of Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe and the effect, the shocking effect it had on the bourgeois patrons of the day, and in fact on the emperor of the time itself, it was exhibited in 1863. We can think about the Renaissance artist Giorgione, as mentioned earlier, and his use of unnatural life sources. Whether the gaze of his, I call her the subject, although we have one of the men also gazing out towards us, but she is the one who holds our attention, who arrests our view. Whether or not that gaze confronts the viewer on a sexual level is debatable. I think it's much more complicated than that, and she's dismantling and disrupting the concept of sexuality, again, challenging its boundaries by claiming it, by claiming her nudity for herself. Looking at the more formal aspects of this painting, again, this transformation of a reclining Venus into an unidealized modern woman who is recognizable by detail such as her ribbons, slippers, the black cat, her name, would have been recognized as a prostitute. Staring at the spectator with this boldness, that again is another way of bridging boundaries and changing the relationship between the made, the imagined, and the real, as we see with classic Impressionism, such as Monet's Impression Sunrise, shatters the divide between experiencing reality and the thing itself. Technically, it's, I think, if not brilliantly, beautifully rendered, the silhouetting of this pale nude against a dark wall and the red underpainting. The black maidservant is bringing flowers, it's imagined offered by a client. The presence of the black cat, the way that the volumetric aspects of the figure are created, are rendered through its contours. Again, this strong light and dark pattern, completely different from something like chiaroscuro, the dramatic contrast of black and white that we looked at earlier with painters such as Caravaggio. So there's these elements of, let's call it, sexual licentiousness. There are sexual associations with flowers and females as well. So many associative elements in the painting that can be read in the same way that we would look at a Dutch still life and understand the meaning of each of the components included there. Again, Courbet was not a fan, especially of this work. He found this Olympia so disturbing, let's say, in the flatness of these forms, that at that time and place look as if they're compared to other work, as if they're pressed right up against the frontal plane, that Courbet called this painting a queen of spades getting out of a bath, which is intended obviously as a derogatory statement. We're finally getting to Manet's Olympia during the period in which it was made. We've looked at it as examples of other works previously. So was it the subject matter that was so shocking when this subject matter possesses historical precedence? Was it the boldness again of the female nude's gaze? Obviously, one of the influences is Titian's Venus of Urbino, as mentioned earlier, which Manet had copied When he was learning from the grandmasters in Italy, when he was in Florence, he copied this image. But this Olympia was a slap in the face to the academic painters who regularly presented their work as almost scarcely disguised eroticism. Venus reclining has been transformed into this highly modern woman, a very self-possessive one, or one exhibiting great self-possession. Um, it's widely imagined, conjectured, yes, she is a prostitute. This is conveyed in entirely unsentimental fashion. Um, Flowers, cat, a black maid, all this is considered degenerative. As an aside, tangentially, there is I think, fabulous exhibition curated by a contemporary female African American curator that includes this image and in the context of, as is the rest of the exhibition, in the context of new art historical curatorial ways of interpreting images made during this period, and a few others of African Americans as well as blacks from other places. It's believed that Manet's technique here just further inflamed the controversy surrounding Olympia. Again, that flatness, those very bold brushstrokes, laying down the color, that green of the draperies in the backdrop is also seen in another of his notable images of the time called The Balcony. One of the criticisms of the time was the paint just sits there on the surface of the canvas. And as it was later interpreted by an art historian, that it wasn't just the fact that this woman is a nude and a lower class nude, but the fact that she was painted in a style that many people regarded as unskilled, as almost in some way childish. We referenced briefly Thomas Eakins' The Gross Clinic when we looked at Rembrandt's Dr. Tulp. And I've included that image on slide 62 following this one. A master realist, Eakins, in so many works of this period within just a few short years. Nothing like the Impressionists, but a classic representational painter of realism in America, fusing the art of painting and the realism of the science at the time. He may even have been the greatest American portraitist. The Gross Clinic certainly emulates Rembrandt's Dr. Tulp, but everything that Eakins does has a very acutely, in a sense, more American of his time. Eakins and Winslow Homer were the two most emblematic American realist painters of that time. There's a specificity and a use of, and an observation of everyday gestures and a use of light that makes Eakins' work so very distinctive. When we consider some of the art movements that result from modernity, the new modern age, modernism, such as Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, we really have to think about the progression of these movements in the light of their time, again, as examples of the zeitgeist. Looking at Impressionism here, why is this the most radical and perhaps the first real example of what we call modern art? Because it undermined traditional subject matter, content in favor of the artist's impressions and the artist abstracting of reality in favor of the way that reality appeared to them. Again, just to harken back to where we are at this time and this time period, we have this growing new capitalist economy and urban labor force, all of which and whom demand more visual information, leading to the onslaught, the barrage that we experience today. So the steamship, the telegraph, the iron printing press, producing lithographs like Jane Averill, are all moving people and information forward at this accelerated rate. Pictures sold product. Publishers learn this, and then they learn to exploit the camera and its possibilities. There is a new divide between art for society's sake and art for art's sake. This was a key moment in the trajectory of modern art when a court case that confronted these two utterly separate approaches and beliefs and really philosophies about the meaning, the construct, the value of art. It was a court case between the painter Whistler and the art critic John Ruskin in the courts at that time. Going back here to what we're looking at Monet's painting, Impression Sunrise, what are we seeing? We're seeing something that might be called erasing or blurring sensations. A sensation, an impression, in a way that seems to break down the boundaries between the self and the world. Something that also is often appearing and being described in other genres of art, literary arts, in the literature of the 19th century. We have the advent of the first work, significant work, that is dismantling, as Cubism does shortly after Impressionism, dismantling these ways of conceiving, of experiencing, describing the relationship between self and the world. So Monet's use of abstraction here is evoking what an artist is experiencing while painting. Again, this is a highly unusual, unorthodox approach that will become a customary one following the advent of this movement of Impressionism. So the title, Impressionism Sunrise, not only provides critics with this name that arises out of mocking the painter and his colleagues in this movement, but impression is conveying, in essence, the transitory, fleeting, the most subjective nature, not objective nature of the painting. It's Monet's visual experience, his impression of what he observed during that sunrise. It proclaims the validity of the artist's subjective, not objective perspective. What do we see when we're looking at it? Reflections on the water are suggested by these broken, short brush strokes. And we see the ghostly forms, not well delineated, of boats and smokestacks. These are described with loose patches of color rather than very gradual gradations of light and dark tones. There's also the idea that water can't be captured. There are no uniform patterns of colors, more dabs, objects drawn in a way that's very busy, that abruptly moves the visitor's gaze around the painting. Again, this idea, this novel, this revolutionary idea that artists are no longer faithfully required to capture real life because the camera fulfills that imperative. We understand that we have this spitting, lifelike reproduction of life in a daguerreotype, freeing painting to represent the artists. The artist has agency now. The artist is important in a new way in this new age to be representative of the artist's desires, emotions, yes, skill, but employed in a new way, skillful in terms of rendering concept. So these are the precursors to the idea of conceptual art in a way, also. Concept in a new way. So the artist may be accused of not being skillful, even though they're perfectly capable of doing so. Many of them, including Picasso, and we see this in Picasso's broad range of work, can paint just as faithfully in the classical realist sense as any painters that came before them. What they're doing that's different is not following the old language and vocabulary of painting. We do have painters who are painting realistic, in a sense, landscape still. Plein air painters, plein air being outside. Um, and we will see that the way they're still doing something that's novel, following some of the old guidelines. So there's a great deal of variation in terms of how we employ the idea of the figurative or representational at this point. Technology is affecting not just the camera's abilities to render reality. Oil paint is now portable in tubes. This changes the way painting can occur too. Plein air, outside painting, occurs because painters are bringing their easels outside. It seems like a modest advancement to us now, but it was a significant one at the time. The fact that oil paint was now encased in tubes. Rembrandt couldn't paint outside his studio. So when we look at, again, Impression Sunrise, which was shown in 1874 and much derided in Paris, we get the idea of what? The impression of water as this ever-changing surface that can never fully be captured. It conveys the transitory, fleeting, and subjective nature of painting. Monet's loose handling of paint, his focus on light and atmosphere within what earlier would have been described as a traditional landscape scene, but not the way he created it. These, again, are all key characteristics of Impressionism. What matters is the artist's impression, the artist's experience. In a sense, the artist replaces their own idea of atmospheric effects or conditions. They replace that idea, the perspective of a traditional landscape, with the idea of experience. So when we're talking about Impressionism, also important to remember that it is, from one perspective, from the modern perspective, a more, I would call it, sophisticated interpretation of and rendering of what is reality. Because something like the way water constantly changes depending on the light shining upon it is more akin to these constantly changing images in this new and modern age with which we are being presented and maybe increasingly confronted by. This is more like reality. There is no such thing as fixed reality. In history, not just art history today, historians seem to have consensus on the fact that there is no truth. It depends on who tells it and at what time, because we have shifting historical perspectives on what really happened. When we keep that in mind, looking at Monet's cathedral, we can understand that what fascinated him was the way that the shifting of light over the course of a day of a cathedral he painted multiple times represented different perspectives, different views, different ideas, different ways of understanding, quote unquote, reality. In this quite delightful depiction of a delightful evening in the bohemian sector of Paris at the time, at a club, let's call it, a restaurant really, called Moulin de la Galette. we see this really remarkably lighthearted and joyful representation of working class people and artists gathered together. His use of the way he creates these not quite pointillist George Seurat-like effects with light, but the way he connects the dancing of the light um, from the garments of and around the dancers on the floor, with the lighting above them, with the glasses on the table, is, while it's a very jumbled together um, composition, is one that is thought of still as being something that is a representation of Impressionism, although it's not as jarringly different from some realism as some of the Impressionist work we've seen. It is still, yet distinctly, an Impressionist view of an experienced scene. Bertha Morisot's Summer's Day is notable for, let's say, two things. One is this is the idea of a woman painting women. Recall the scarcity of women painters in our trajectory across art history so far. Morisot, again, someone privileged, one had to be, as we have seen with each of the women painters we've studied. She is actually the sister-in-law of Edouard Manet. And again, we have to differentiate between Claude Monet, he of Impression Sunrise, and Edouard Manet, who we have looked at and will again in this audio lecture, for most notably for his Luncheon on the Grass and his Olympia, which is that, in a sense, his redo, his take on Titian's Venus of Urbino. So there is a difference one might find in a woman painting women, Bertha Morisot's Summer's Day here, and it is also an excellent, a perfect example of the genre of plein air, outside outdoor painting, again made possible through tubes of paint that were previously not available in that mass culturally produced format that they are now available to painters in. Degas' the rehearsal on stage is not only significant for its angular viewpoint, that of the spectator, it's also a very contrived scene. And we have these patrons, or let's say wealthy men, who are in some way that is not quite discernible to us, related to this scene of dancers and the sense of patronage, or perhaps something more, not quite clear, but in terms of how the rehearsal is interpreted, it is definitely something that is suggested that these men are more than just philanthropic painters of these dancers. Not to cast any aspersions onto them or their character, but certainly a phenomenon that was present in this place and time. Degas' The Tub is not on your lecture guide, but it's notable, as an aside here, for the way that it completely upends and disrupts the traditional male eroticized view of women. Perhaps you would disagree. The point of this painting is that women at the bath is a very traditional subject, and it's a voyeuristic one. If we think about those wealthy patrons lounging about Degas' rehearsal, we have this binary, power-oriented gender relationship being represented. Here, we see this figure from above, which is a different perspective than one that usually occurs. It's also Degas, in a sense, privileging this minute observation of an intimate everyday gesture. There are many at this time paintings, representations, drawings of women at their bath, at their toilet, as it was called, or toilette, Toilettete, often rendered in a far more romantic way. Nude women were idealized in the classical sense. This is an image that is sometimes thought to derive from, or in some, according to some representations, from a piece of the first or second century, which was called Crouching Aphrodite. We also have the introduction or the inclusion of Japonisme, the Japanese style of perspective and painting that is quite popular and fashionable at this time. And again, this rather plunging perspective. There's also the idea that this woman is crouching in a way that makes her look more animal-like in a derogatory sense, or although that doesn't seem to be the prevailing interpretation of her. If we're framing it and contextualizing it at the time, we're also keeping in mind the idea that women washing themselves are ubiquitous in the history of Western art, fitting under the rubric, the umbrella of the female nude, for long one of the most important subjects of artistic expression. At certain moments in time, though, if we recall the way that we see men and women represented, we see classical male nude sculptures during Greek times and later in the Roman approximation of Greek sculpture, Neo-Greek at that time, neoclassical. There's also this idea of what's occurring in terms of public health at this time. Public health officials in Paris, cosmopolitan capital, are encouraging regular bathing, not just as a way to be more hygienic, but also as a way to combat diseases such as cholera, which are not uncommon at the time. So more people are washing indoors. The idea of indoor plumbing, tubs and taps for running water are new. If we view the tub in that way, we're looking at it as a representation of the late 19th century more progressive artists who are looking at contemporary subject matter and eschewing traditional historical themes of painting. So again, this representation of women at their bath is one that incorporates elements of Japonisme, is an unorthodox and often thought uneroticized view of women bathing compared with what comes before. So we include Georges Seurat in the post-impressionism movement. How do they differ? Monet and Renoir we can group more securely within the genre of impressionism, which was slightly starting to be accepted. The larger field of post-impressionism covered a wide range of styles. The post-impressionists shared many of the same sensibilities as the impressionists, and this idea of recording experience and impressions. But they had a larger field of difference, let's say, between this new avant-garde of impressionism beginning to be accepted and the wide divide from there of a larger academic and societal acceptance. So what is La Grande Jatte here, a Sunday afternoon on the island of La Grande Jatte? Well, a Sunday outing, a promenade. La Grande Jatte is an island. It's a mile-long island just outside of Paris. What do we have here in terms of pictorial space, perspective depth, something quite different. In a sense, we have a combination of classical, traditional, even Renaissance like perspective painting with some very modern forays into painting that does something quite different, that maneuvers pattern, maneuvers color and light with a different freedom that we've seen previously, as well as we can almost call it a rigidity um, in the subjects depicted. So pointillism, again, is this manner of laying down different sized dots, placing unblended colors next to each other to create a new kind of depth of color experience. And these brushstrokes were quite small, smaller than a pea even. And again, there are multiple ones. Subject-wise, La Grande Jatte is often the walking promenade ground of the upper class, but here Seurat depicts more of the middle class, working, and even some level of artist depicted. So not the upper class. The idea that many different social levels can, if not gather, can occupy the same public space for a Sunday afternoon stroll. And this would be quite representative too of Seurat, who was an anarchist, one for all for one, and no strict authoritarian regime, certainly. We see a river on the left and some sailing boats, rowing boats, matched by the larger expanse, the water cutting the swath of a diagonal through the upper left of the image, the much larger expanse of this green on which these citizens are strolling. 48 people, 3 dogs, 8 boats. Seurat went through many sketches of creating a composition as complex as this one, and including, again, such a wide range of social classes. Soldiers, young, old, many different kinds of dress. Several canvases were made out of this that were not the final drawing. It is comprised of this great flurry of activity in the middle, where we see a young girl twirling. Our perspective is directed where? Straight on, mostly sideways, as are, for the most part, the subjects depicted here. That also is what contributes to that idea of rigidity, almost as if they're toy soldiers, which was one of the criticisms leveled against this work at the time. If we look at the color palette up close, we see the degree of shadow and light that Seurat is depicting, and he's almost engaging in a far earlier way of doing that, a 15th century way. Again, a Renaissance way. These tiny strokes of complementary color and linear perspective, kind of diminishing or blurring together the idea of their differences. They congeal, they combine to form an overall effect. Because again, these are very tiny dots. And the blending technique is really achieved through the way Seurat uses shadow. In traditional painting, shadows are represented by what color? Black. But according to the principles of pointillism, Seurat defines his shadows by the color that they come into contact with. So if we look at the skirts of the women, the clothing of the women in the center of the piece primarily seem to be casting this. Here it looks greenish, but it's actually bluish shadow on the ground. So The shadows are created through a combination of colors as opposed to just variations on black. The mix of green provides a blue shadow. Um, Light and green casts a more yellow halo for the trees in the background. Some of the shadows cast by the dresses of the women are a lighter shade of blue. And we see the, well, typical green grass. Those dots are intermingling with the blue and purplish dots on some of the women's dresses. So this use of light is quite spectacular and certainly one of the most unique, original points of this painting. There's this, if we could see it for real up close, I've included some details below. It's very vibrant, and the sun is just sort of bathing all the subjects inhabiting this painting in this mid-afternoon glow. Color is really supreme here. The blending of colors, the technique of pointillism is the primary concern of this painting. And as this technique's founder, Seurat is here, as he should be, the one who epitomizes this technique, the most exemplary proponent or practitioner of it. We see it everywhere. We see it in the tree line at the top of the painting, the way that is blended, the way that the white day of the upper left skyline becomes less white until it seamlessly blends with the green of the tree leaves. What else are we seeing in terms of subjects and style? Well, pointillism was certainly like nothing that had come before it. And it was, understandably for its time, greeted with, received with quite a great degree of disapproval on the part of both art critics and society and the general public. Not big fans of that technique. One way of expressing what Seurat does here is something that he called chromoluminarism. It really just means how color and brushstrokes evoke emotions and how the close proximity of different primary colors create a third color. Gaiety in this formula is represented by upward lines and luminous hues. Calm is the balance of light and dark and horizontal lines. Sadness is conveyed through dark, cold colors and downward lines, understandably, so it's almost self-explanatory. The main color theme in some of Seurat's other work is quite different, more orange and brown than here. In some of his other works, there's one called Le Chariot, about the can-can that we're not working at. But the important thing to remember about Seurat is his pointillism technique, formula, the way his brushstrokes create that, and how scientific, almost a methodology, his approach is. Just including a quick look here at a Mark Rothko painting. We looked at Mark Rothko at the very beginning, first week of class. We will look at him in our final week of class. An example of how this progression in introducing a way of thinking about colors related to experience, Rothko being thought of as a painter who works in an extremely emotionally meditative, expressive way in terms of his use of color.